Hello, everybody. Good evening, and thank you for coming. My name is David Kraemer. I am director of the library here at the Jewish Theological Seminary. Thank you, thank you. And under ordinary circumstances, I begin library-sponsored book talks by saying something like, we as the Jewish Theological Seminary Library, a center of Jewish books and concern for Jewish history and identity and so forth, have the privilege of featuring important new books in the Jewish world, right? So, and we've done all kinds of things, different genres and so forth. It would be a little bit too awkward for me to actually do that introduction now. It would be sort of, it's like Philip Roth quoting Philip Roth quoting Philip Roth in Operation Shylock. So rather than be as fully awkward as I might be, I invited my dear longtime friend, Rabbi Irwin Kula, to interview me. I look forward to it. It's just going to be wonderful. He and I have been involved in parts of this conversation for many, many years, as I have been with many of you as well. And I am quite sure that with Irwin's lead and the questions he asked, this conversation will be far richer than it otherwise would have been. I would just add that at the end there will be an opportunity for questions from the folks who are here, and in any case, and there will be books for sale. Irwin.
Okay, hi everybody. I gotta be like 100% upfront and transparent. I am not objective. I mean, I know how to be objective. I know how to be very critical, but this is really a challenge because I love David. He's one of my dearest friends. We've studied together almost every week for the last 20 years. And a good portion of this book, he has talked out with me over the years. So that's one. The second thing is, I do want to say this before we start. I consider, and now I'm going to say Dr. Kraemer, and then I'll do David the rest of the time, a unique voice in academia and in Jewish studies, and here's why. I have read all 11 books. Okay, 11 books, right? Yeah, I think so. I have read all 11 books. And not only have they been an influence on my thinking, but I've had the opportunity to teach parts of all 11 books, right, to American Jewry. And so I really do know how David thinks, and I have a deep appreciation for the intellectual work. And here's what every book combines. And I want you to think about this as we have the discussion. Every single book combines the following. One, careful and meticulous scholarship, of course, okay? Although I shouldn't say of course, all right? Two, unusual clarity and accessibility in writing, and that is not always the case in academia, right? Three, he addresses subjects that are always that have profound implications for contemporary challenges. But he does so, and this is a really significant art, he does so without giving solutions to the contemporary challenges. And when you finish reading, what happens is you are opened up to new possibilities. And the reason for that is because both as an incredible textual reader, Talmudist, but also as a historian of the ideas, what he's able to do is to recover parts of the past that, for many, many reasons, get covered up. And the way in which we remember our past controls the parameters of the future. So if you can open up and do it with grace, and do it without needless provocation, which in this society is not so easy, if you can do that without provoking, but open up and say, oh, wow, I can't tell you how many, I'm going to show you this book. Look at this. Look how much writing's in this book. Not so much writing. Every time I write there, it's an oh, wow. That past can be remembered in different ways, it is breathtakingly hopeful, and to even use the word hopeful today is hopeful, breathtakingly hopeful about the future. And on that, now I'm ready to begin. So I thought that like what we should do first thing is, at least the basic argument. Here the book is called The Case for the Diaspora, Embracing the Exile, but the case for the diaspora is the title, right? Embracing the Exile comes after. And obviously, as soon as you say the case for Jewish diaspora, I'm sure every single person here goes, the case for the diaspora, right? What do you mean there's a case for the diaspora, even though we're living in the great diaspora? The case for the diaspora, because the conventional, dominant, canonical read of the diaspora, I'm sure you can all finish it, once we were sovereign and then we got destroyed and went to exile and everything is terrible and until you get to the Shoah, and then that's really terrible, and now we're in Israel and well, we won't finish, that's really terrible. But it's, Churban and Galut, right, are, I would say, negative categories, and what you do in this book is make a case for diaspora. So maybe just if you can start by sort of offering the central argument of the book, because most people haven't read the book yet. So the central argument of the book.
Okay, thanks. So first of all, let me say that you have just done something that a number of readers have done, right? And I and the experts at Oxford University Press, I think, didn't appreciate what happened. Right, which is actually, the title of the book is Embracing Exile, subtitle, The Case for Jewish Diaspora. But the way it appears, by way of the design of the cover, makes it look the other way around. And of course, it doesn't make any difference. Right? I mean, it could be either, you just need something with a little bit of alliteration for the main title, but otherwise, The Case for Jewish Diaspora actually it perfectly captures what I try to do in the book. So the thesis is very, very simple. It begins with a recognition that Jews have been, through our history, overwhelmingly, that's both numerically and in terms of numbers of years, a diaspora people. From the time of the Babylonian exile in the early part of the 6th century BCE until roughly the present day, more or less, the majority of the world's Jews have lived outside of the land of Israel. And this was even the case when Jews were given permission to return to the land of Israel when the Persian Empire displaced the Babylonian Empire, right? And under Cyrus, please, you're welcome to go back to the land of Israel. And many of the Jews who had already begun to make very fine homes in Babylon and in Persia, and Jews from the very beginning actually spread out through this world in remarkable ways. In a somewhat indirect way, in Esther, where it describes Jews as being dispersed for the many, many kingdoms of the Persian Empire, that was reality. And as a consequence of that, right, even when the Jewish population in the land of Israel was strong until the revolt against Rome, until the destruction of the temple, and then in the years following, where there continued to be a very vibrant Jewish community in the land of Israel, nevertheless, there was always a strong diaspora, and again, numerically and otherwise, it was probably the larger factor in the totality of Jewish life, even if we don't record all of its details, because at least early on, more of the literature comes from Jews in the land of Israel, right? Now, if people live a certain way, human beings have this habit, and that habit is we justify who we are. Now, justification can happen in a number of ways, but we make sense of our lives, we make sense of the choices that we make, right? We try to claim to ourselves and to others that our place in the world makes sense and is good. And if it is true, as it is, that Jews were a diaspora people for the vast majority of our history, this means that Jews must have created justifications of diaspora, right? Must have looked at diaspora not only as exile in the negative sense, but as a place where Jewish life could thrive and flourish, as Jews often did in the midst of our troubles, right? I mean, every history is a mixed history. Of course, we experienced many of the troubles that we all know about, but in between those troubles, we experienced a lot of very peaceful and even flourishing life as well. And we had to develop teachings and traditions that actually supported that, and that is what this book seeks to document.
You know what, so that's great. So give us, I counted, I think there's at least 15, 16 different justifications, okay? And I'm sure I'm parsing in a way, and I know in the beginning of the book you parsed 5 or 6, but I think that give like 2 or 3 justifications that you think are going to be most compelling or that were most surprising to you in doing the research. And it doesn't matter to me. Or maybe even an arc of justifications.
Well, I mean, there were those that I knew about but hadn't put together with others. I mean, part of the task of this book actually is we know some of these traditions, but we fail to put them together into a fabric that shows that actually this was an important part of Jewish teaching and tradition through the ages, right? So, Jeremiah, right, when the exiles go to Babylon in his very famous letter, tells Jews to go and settle and plant gardens and build houses and pray for the welfare of the nation where they find themselves. Many synagogues still recite that reference as part of, right, in the prayer for the country, exactly. And he actually articulated critique of those other prophets, the prophets whose names we don't remember because they did not become canonical, who said, no, don't go to Babylon.
You can't make it.
Right? Yeah. And Jeremiah's response, Ezekiel the same, right, was go there because that is God's will. And if it's God's will that Jews go there, that means that God is going to accompany them into that exile. And as it turns out, one of the most common justifications, and this shows up again and again and again in every mode of Jewish thinking and literature, in every generation and period, is that wherever Jews go, God is with them. Even to the extent, and this begins in the Talmud in this formulation, but continues in a very powerful way into Jewish mysticism, into Kabbalah, that not only does God accompany you, but God experiences what you experience. If you're thinking of the embodied Jesus and the power of that notion, that's relevant here, right? Because we want to believe that those who love us and whom we love can really feel what we're feeling. And so this notion of the Shekhinah, the divine presence, following Israel through its exiles and requiring redemption in the same way as Jews require ultimately redemption. What this says is that God cares so much about us, right, that God is with us wherever we go. And if God is with you wherever you go, then what is the importance of any particular land? Right? And that actually had its consequences. And we see that spelled out again and again and again, to the extent that when we look at some of the great Hasidic masters, they taught that if you pray with proper kavanah, with proper intention, if you learn Torah and so forth, that you will bring Zion to you. Where you are is the land of Israel. The air you breathe in Poland is the air of the land of Israel. Right? That's probably its most radical expression.
Yeah, I was struck that in the Maharal chapter, that radical, you write this way, something like, exile becomes the diaspora, becomes the natural place, and it's actually Zion that's unnatural. And that's a pretty significant reversal in 1800 years, of a tradition moving, let's say from Jeremiah to the Maharal. And it strikes me that there's something about this justification, the way of doing it, the ability to metabolize loss and not allow loss to completely defeat you. There's something either in the well, maybe you reflect, like this, how do you account for this ability to metabolize loss this way? And I know there's no answer. I'm at here it's not the book, it's you reflecting.
Yeah. So, but let me begin with the Maharal. First of all, because not everybody knows who the Maharal was, but also because you and I have studied the Maharal. That's been our most recent pursuit. I have to add with Michael Paley, I mean, it's crucially important. I mean, the Maharal, who lived and taught in the latter half of the 16th century, Maharal of Prague. So, you know, I mean, he spent a short portion of his life actually in Prague, but in Bohemia. And he was an eclectic, brilliant, self-taught, unpredictable mind. I mean, we've been shocked again and again and again.
And that already says something, right?
Right.
That you can produce people who are that eclectic in, I mean, whatever suffering is going on, it's vital enough that you're producing these sorts of people.
Yeah, and you know, as we've commented, it's interesting. You know, how do you go on after loss? How do you? You never leave the lament behind, right? You want to preserve the lament, but you have to recognize that the lament has a place while you go ahead, right? So the reversal we see in the Maharal, and this I think characterizes. I'm being essentialist here, but I'm going to say it anyhow. It characterizes Jewish DNA, right? For many,
I have the word DNA in there.
many centuries, is the fact that we both preserve and build even radically new. I mean, I mean, the reason I devoted myself first to the study of rabbinic Judaism was because I believed that in fact is what the rabbinic model holds. Is preserving, right, but also building radically new. The Maharal does say exactly as you quote. I mean, it's just astounding that until the unnatural future period, and he describes it as unnatural because it's miraculous, that is to say, the coming of the Messiah, until that period, diaspora is the natural home of Jews, and the land of Israel would be unnatural. And he says it in a really interesting way, right? I think the most interesting statement is he uses ancient which turned medieval science to make a claim that things exist only in their natural place. They won't survive in a place that's unnatural to them. So if you look at the history of Jews who have survived for so many generations,
in so many places,
right, in so many places in diaspora, this is obviously proof that diaspora is natural to the Jews, right? And he gives other proof that the land of Israel is not natural to the Jews. But then he says, why is diaspora natural to the Jews? He quotes a beautiful teaching which says that, self-serving from a Jewish perspective, but it has beautiful consequences, God would not have created the world if not for the Jews. Okay? God actually had Jews in mind. But what that means is that Jews are a world people. Right. If the world was created on account of the Jews, Jews are a world people, and that means that the natural place for Jews to live is the entire world.
Dispersed,
right. And so, you know, Maharal is there. He is joined, as we've noted in our study, he's joined, as are so many Jews in so many communities at that time, by Sephardi refugees. Right? Sephardi refugees coming to Central Europe, coming to Italy, coming to the Ottoman realm, created new possibilities, and often in fusion with Jewish populations who were already there. Jewish communities that had lived in the Italian peninsula for a very long time. Ashkenazi Jews in Central Europe. By bringing that together, the friction, right, which is always creative, of the different Jewish traditions coming face to face with one another, allowed for a new building. Can I share just a little short, a very important story for me? The single most spiritual moment of my life, right? And I am willing to say this, took place in a synagogue in Poland on a Friday night after I and a group that my wife and I were with, others, friends who were here, had gone to Auschwitz that day. And the synagogue, Krakow, beautiful. There was an Israeli chazan with an absolutely gorgeous voice, and he's singing Lecha Dodi. And he sings the lines, Rav lach shevet be'emek habacha, which means, correctly translated, enough of dwelling in the valley of tears. Rav lach shevet be'emek habacha. And I sat and I said to myself, oh my God, this is almost literally the exact number of years after the expulsion as I and we are after the Holocaust. And how were they able to do that? Yes, the Holocaust and the expulsion were very, very different, right? I don't want to equate them, but they were experienced as vast losses. And the ability, the strength, the hope, usually, right? The hope to be able to do that is just extraordinary, and we have done that.
Yeah, it seems like maybe we could move to this part. Given that I'm sitting in JTS, there's a very, very important article by a past chancellor, right, Gerson Cohen, called "The Blessing of Assimilation," and you quoted in the book, and we've talked about that article. But it seems that, you look at the American anxiety around assimilation, which, in 1990, when those continuity commissions came out, and the Jewish community, in many ways, at least the capital flows, really organized around, oh my gosh, we better fight assimilation, and then the particular ways they fought it. I don't think anybody sitting around those tables, I was around a lot of those tables, and I often even said, assimilation is a double-edged sword here. I don't think we're seeing everything. And one of the things that comes out in the cases for the diaspora is that in one place after another, there's a very thin line between assimilation, adaptation, the fissure that creates something new. And maybe you can reflect on that.
When Gerson Cohen gave that talk, which became the article, he actually offered it as a graduation address at Hebrew College in Boston in 1966 to graduates. He was being intentionally provocative. Right? His provocation was that all of you were worried, and as you said, it became only more alarmed after that. All of you people are terribly worried about assimilation, we're going to disappear, da-da-da-da, right? He said, actually, if you look back at the history of Jews in their various homes, assimilation has been good for Jews and Judaism. Right? What I think he meant, or maybe I should put it this way, the term that I would prefer to assimilation, because assimilation is used in a particular way, is acculturation. Right? And one of the things that is most important emergent from recent generations of historical scholarship on the Jews is the recognition that there is not a place we have been where we haven't actually learned and adapted, absorbed, been influenced by the local culture. The local culture has become ours. And French Jewish culture was different than Italian Jewish culture, which was different than Spanish Jewish culture, and so forth. All of that because we lived in those various homes. We learned their poetry. We learned their song. I could never have written this.
Cuisine.
Yeah, no, everything. I couldn't have written this book, at least not in the way that I wrote it, if I had not been the librarian here at JTS, because my experience over the last 20 years has been to be exposed to hear surviving evidence, the great Jewish manuscripts and then printed books, that provide testimony to Jewish life through the ages in Jewish homes around the world. And if you look at the quality of the artwork, the beauty of the decoration, the wealth exhibited in many of these works, right? It's hard to look at one of these luxury manuscripts from Central Europe in 1290 and say that this was an impoverished, oppressed community, right? And they produced this? I mean, it's one of the, it's more expensive than, I don't know, choose your favorite, luxury item today. I mean, we're talking about vast luxury. And diving into that material and everything that it introduces, so much of which is unexpected, not only what Jews experienced, but the way Jewish scribal writing in Italy looks like local Latin writing, and Jewish writing, right, using Hebrew letters in lands where Arabic is spoken and written, looks like Arabic, and so forth. All of this is the evidence of the way we were, and I'm going to use this term very intentionally, and it follows Cohen, we were enriched by those many experiences. And if not for that ability, if not for that opportunity, Jews and Judaism would have been that much poorer.
So good, that leads us, we don't have to go contemporary, but why do you think then that in this diaspora, right, the American diaspora, and I know that's a large term, the American diaspora, but it is the most powerful, the most affluent, the most integrated we've been, that the canonical story has had such a hold. And especially, if it didn't have such a hold, the chances are you wouldn't have written the book.
Correct.
Right?
Correct.
And so, because it really has. Now, I understand it's in the Siddur, so the liturgy really doesn't really make a case for the diaspora, although the very fact of having a Siddur does make a case for, in some crazy way, makes a case. But, what do you think? It has had the canonical take has had such a hold on us.
It has had an immense take, and I think it's...
it feels like we're at an inflection point, and we'll get to, but before the inflection point.
I think it's a consequence of recent historical experience. Early on in the book, if I want to make the counter-argument, and the counter-argument is not an argument that the canonical position is quote-unquote wrong.
Right. You're very
It's an
careful.
argument that it's incomplete.
Right. You're very
and it's
careful about
imbalanced. Okay, and that's very important. And one of the things, early on I address exactly this question. Why did the canonical story become the canonical story? And yes, prayer was part of the answer, and what, biblical texts that taught this lesson, right, which were known by more Jews than, say, rabbinic texts or others, right? The Bible was more influential. Those were better known. But I think, as much as anything else, the two modern factors, Zionism itself and the catastrophic anti-Semitism of the 20th century. Right? Both of those things made the canonical story make sense.
Right, so they make the canonical story really hold. And Zionism, I like the way you said Zionism before the Shoah.
Yeah.
After the Shoah, it doubles down. But before the Shoah, it's already pretty clear, at least the Herzlian take, that the only response to the incredible amounts of anti-Semitism, the solution was not keep reframing, move to another diaspora. It was, this is going to be, which of course is an integration of nationalism anyhow. So even that is an integration of a diaspora idea.
Listen, it had to
That's
be
so
that
funny.
way. Zionism is an ism, right? All
Right.
of our isms.
So by
are isms.
definition.
Like all ideologies, right, they choose particular ways to tell the story. Right? And this particular ideology, Zionism, told the story in a way that supported the creation of a nation state in the land of Israel and diminished or denied the value of Jewish life elsewhere, or at least indicated that it was time for it to end. And while that wasn't the only view, it was, to be sure, a dominant view. And those of us who grew up in the aftermath of the Holocaust, that was the version that we learned again and again. And it was very important to us. It was very important to me.
It did make sense.
Yes.
We've done those trips.
Exactly.
We've taught.
Exactly. The problem, though, is that I think that as a consequence, we who live in diaspora didn't respect our own choices. Correct. And we, gave ourselves short shrift, as it were. And in our devotion to Israel, which it was and is very, very important, I think the priorities were somewhat skewed. Right? And I love, if you'll permit me to do this, I'm sorry to do this, but when I saw this, it was, and I sent this to you immediately when I saw it, the first general review of the book appeared prematurely, before it was actually published in the Jerusalem Post early on in April. And they then did a social media bit on it. And they got it so perfectly. I was thrilled when I saw it. So without going through the whole thing, their last two panels on their post on Facebook and Instagram say, Kraemer draws from biblical texts and Jewish history to show how exile wasn't just survival. It became a platform for creativity, resilience, and cultural richness. From Babylon to Brooklyn, Jewish life has thrived far beyond the land of Israel. At a time of growing polarization between Israel and the diaspora, embracing exile calls for unity. That's exactly right. right? Not around one place, but around shared identity.
This is the Jerusalem Post.
Right, around shared identity. A powerful reminder, Jewish life doesn't need one home to flourish. It already has many. I could not have imagined doing anything close to that good, let alone better.
And think about where that's,
Exactly.
It's not on the forward.
Exactly.
It's in the Jerusalem Post. I think that leads to, it feels like we're in some sort of inflection point. I mean, there's a number of books that are coming out right now about, not the case, one of the things you do in the case for Diaspora that's very, very, very elegant is this is opening up options. It's not closing down existing options. There's not one anti in the book.
Well, I quote anti because of what they say about diaspora,
yes,
but no.
You're not anti this, you're not anti-Zionist. There's no anti. It is how many possibilities can we open up and then see in the synergy between those possibilities what will happen. That invites thinking about the inflection point right now that I think a lot of us are feeling. I think those of us that, whatever thought leaders or whatever it means to be communal leaders right now, you can see so many of the fault lines in American Jewish life. We were just talking before that here's a perfect example. Last Thursday, a woman calls me up, she's 28 years old, graduated Harvard Divinity School, and she has raised quite a significant amount of money for a 28-year-old. To develop a platform for Jewish futurism. So, the Met has a Afrofuturism. She's taken that template of Afrofuturism, having really sort of enmeshed herself in that, and that's just all that is for this sake it's the integration of literature, art, science fiction, and technology to create a reimagined past, okay? Think of, those movies, those black futurism, Afrofuturism movies, I forget the names of them, but it's, those heroes. That's the imagination to try to create a different past that then you'll use to create different nutrients for a different future. And, I mean, she was amazing, and I said, how many people are you, what is this? So, first of all, before I talk to her, I have to Google Afrofuturism. I have to read 4 articles so I don't sound like an idiot or, so that's already crazy generationally. But she says, we have about 500 people who are sort of involved already in this community. I know, what do you mean you have 500 people already involved in this community? Yeah, this has a possibility of really being a really important form of Jewishness. I go, huh. And Zionism has no role in it except this. She says, when Jewish futurism takes off, when Jewish futurism takes off, Zion will be reimagined. Because Zionism right now, she experiences as completely based on vulnerability and weakness and power. But once you stop remembering your past that way, by having that science fiction past, it will create new opportunities of understanding what the state is and what sovereignty is. And I go, that's an inflection point to me. Wow, that's happening. So I'm just curious on whatever response, because there is something happening. We're seeing the split. We're seeing a doubling down on legacy institutions, anti-Semitism. There's something, this diaspora is no different, it's 1932, all of that language that is the canonical story being lived out. And I'm not saying there isn't increased I'm not saying that I'm interested in the psychology and the feelings of it. And then you have a younger generation, like this woman, and like my kids, the truth is, who are saying, this diaspora, I don't even need a case for it. It's my diaspora, it's my home, and I justify it every day in the way in which I live, and I have communities that I live in, and so just curious about
I mean, first of all, I think it's important that you raise the generational gap, and this has been much commented upon, as we all know, since October 7th in particular. I do want this book to offer a foundation and strength to a next generation of Jews who are arguing for diaspora alternatives, right? Well and good that they don't need the book to justify, and I believe that that's true. But the fact is that they will be taken more seriously and take themselves more seriously to the degree that they root themselves in a very long tradition and take advantage of it. And I hope that this serves that purpose. In terms of the Jewish future, right? I'm going to do what I always do at a moment like this, which is to quote someone else, so I don't put myself on the spot. But from the choice, of course, you can you can detect something. That's right, 1 degree of separation. One of the folks whom I quote and discuss with the most love in the book is someone named Rav Shagar. And I love Shagar for 2 reasons. Number one, because Rav Shagar of blessed memory was my niece's father-in-law, whom tragically I got to spend time with only at my niece's wedding in Israel. He had cancer that was undetected and died not long thereafter. But he's a wonderful radical thinker. He actually, I think, sees a model in Maharal, who I mentioned before. He's very similar in certain qualities, Shagar was, and his writings are becoming available in English. But he says something quite radical. This is a religious Zionist, Shagar, right? I mean, with deep roots in called Judea, Samaria, whatever your favorite terms are, yeshiva, learning, other parts of his wisdom are mostly self-taught. And he makes a very simple statement. And his statement is based upon his own experience and witnessing what his neighbors do. And I just described to you something of who his neighbors were. He says that if Jews in Israel do not preserve the diaspora soul, right? If they fail to preserve for themselves the long Jewish experience of diaspora, right? They are doomed to be their worst selves. Chauvinist, right? Exclusive, violent. These are his words, not mine, right? But I do agree that diaspora offers a corrective for what has developed in Israel. I think he's absolutely right in that, and I think that it's important as we imagine the future. I would love a Jewish future. I've never said this before. I would love a Jewish future where this dichotomy between Zionist and non-Zionist, where it just totally disappears, right? That they are, all of them, a range of important expressions of contemporary Jewish life and soul. All right? I believe that is the hope for our future.
And it's that synergy, actually, that will create the open future. You know, one of the things that I mean, the psychoanalysts in the room know this, that there's this thing called third space, where can you create a space in where the duality is here, but actually there's a third space where there can be a real recognition of the mutual vulnerability, and then that is the creative space that allows for sort of new collective intelligence to emerge. Because collective intelligence can't emerge unless you have new sorts of collectives, by definition. Mm-hmm. So do we have those spaces? And right now, it's almost as if the worst thing that can happen is put the anti-Zionists over there, put the non-Zionists over there. Let's divide up the pro-Zionists into, the
religious,
right, exactly, and J Street and APAC, and let's see if everybody, right, can hate everybody else and avoid learning what they need to learn from somebody else, and that it feels like there's a possibility. I'll tell you a nice story. We had some people over for Shabbos, and there were young people for the most part, and the book, because the book is on my our coffee table right now, because I've read it twice already, and I knew I was going to be here tonight. And somebody looks at the book, one of the kids in their 20s, and says, the case for Jewish diaspora, what's that? So I said, imagine, diaspora, isn't your life great? Yeah, my life is great in diaspora. Wow, and there's been a lot of that. Takes the book, he opens up, I need to read this book. So I'm getting him a copy of the book, you know. So, but I think
it makes a great gift.
It makes a great gift. Well, I actually think it's interesting, you know. I mean, I'm not in sales. Well, I have been in sales actually most of my life, but but actually, I do think for the next generation, because it is accessible, right? That part of the generation that actually doesn't want to get caught up in the anti-Zionist part, but actually wants opportunity, once possibilities opened. I think this is a really interesting book for them. Okay, maybe I'll finish with this and then we'll open for questions. I guess the part of the book that I don't want to say the most exciting, but the part that literally gave me goosebumps of possibility was when towards the end, where you begin to get out there and basically say, look, the human condition may be exile. The human condition is diaspora from the moment we leave the Garden of Eden. In fact, I'll read that passage. Maybe you could read that. Well, you couldn't read it from my book. Jews of... just a second. Eve and Adam were cast out of the garden, so exile is the human condition. All of us must leave our homeland, our parents' home. So exile is the human condition. We're all in exile. And here we must stay. We can lament it as exile, or we can embrace our exiles as our common home in our multiple and diverse diasporas. It struck me that if you are listening to the climate change people and a variety of other people talking about the next 50 years in the world, there's going to be a movement of anywhere between 500 million and 1 billion people in the next 50 years. That's a lot of people who are going to be exiled, refugees, migrants. That's a lot of people who are living in what they think is their homeland. They're going to have a lot of people coming into their homeland. And it struck me that actually there are Jewish lessons about diaspora. There's a Jewish wisdom that is not, I would say, not yet accessible, or we haven't yet taught it to the world. And I don't want to, it's not a pride thing. It is a contribution thing, right? That every so often you get to make a contribution. An individual can make a contribution in ideas, someone can invent something. But what if actually the contribution to be made, because of all the case for the diaspora you make here, and embracing exile, what if actually that's a wisdom that is desperate? Forget about the Jewish people, right? Don't forget about the Jewish people, but desperate for that the world needs to help us navigate this next 50 to 75 years. And it made my heart skip. I guess part because I've grown up and believe the Jewish wisdom does have something to contribute to help human beings flourish as human beings. But most of the time, it's blowing in the wind a lot of times. Mm-hmm. But this felt so real, given what we're experiencing and people moving and what we know is coming. We know it's coming.
Well, I'm going to make it specific in another way,
Good.
And then let's
Good.
open it up.
Good, yes.
We know what's going on in Los Angeles now.
Yeah, right, good.
Right? And I think it forces us all to recognize that, the notion that this land on which I reside is mine, I belong naturally here and no one else, right? What if the people who were being threatened by the ICE agents were my grandparents in Lower Manhattan, right? I don't know where I'd be. I might not be at all.
Yeah, right.
Right? I just imagine who we are collectively. And I think that the Jewish model, particularly as it develops in diaspora, is a very important one, therefore. If more of the world could understand that we all came out of Eden, or we all came out of Africa, or we all sought refuges, right? We all sought, and I mean literally all, right? Sought refuge in one generation or another. If we could recognize that, and recognize, as George Steiner says beautifully, that where we find ourselves is always an accident. We were thrown into this life.
And always a guest.
Right? And we're always there for a guest. That's Steiner's argument. And if we could appreciate that, and if that lesson could be learned by more, maybe there would be fewer examples of what's happening in Los Angeles today, which is so horrific.
Beautiful. Thank you. Wow. I guess questions, then... I mean, I don't need to feel it, but we know everybody. I know most people's name here.
Yeah, so if you're not going to, you know what, I'll do it. Oh, you'll do it? Okay, go ahead.
Still do a little post.
I have two questions.
Yes.
The first one, I hope it's not dumb and obvious to everybody but me, but historically, why did the people in the diaspora feel it necessary to rationalize and justify? That's the first question I'd like to ask. Why did they feel they had to come up with all these rationales? And the second question is, these days, the Zionists and the anti-Zionists call each other illegitimate. Is there a historical precedent for that?
Oh, that's a difficult one. I'll start with the first. I didn't use the term rationalize, right, which has a kind of negative connotation, and I will label it as such. This is what human beings do. We construct stories, narratives, legend, fill in that, right, ideologies, systems, which justify who we are, right? This is just the way things are. Very literally, the way things are. And if that's true, then as a matter of fact, it must be the case that if a people experience something in a certain way for a very, very long time, in ways that they may not even be aware, they nevertheless justified that experience. Right? And so listen, many of the texts that I quote will be known, and some well known, but you then have to analyze them to appreciate the ways that, sometimes unwittingly, they justified the diaspora experience, right? So, the example here, I really counter-read Esther, right? Scroll of Esther, I counter-read against its ritual reception to actually be a book that is more than anything else about the success of Jewish life in diaspora. But you need to work to get there, and it's kind of like going down a level. It's down meaning below the surface, where you recognize, oh my God, these people who are actually experiencing a pretty good life in Persia were writing a story that justified that life in very interesting ways, while admitting, right, its possible dangers. But that's human life. One of the things I think we always need to ask ourselves is, are Jews different here, or are we just experiencing what humans experience? Because Jews are humans.
Hi, David. Thank you. I also have two questions.
I missed the second one, I know. Go ahead, Lenny.
I hope I remember the second one. The first, it has to do with the notion of enrichment. When you spin out the enrichment argument, you end up in miscegenation, and you end up in co-breeding, mixing to the point of reproduction. And of course, we know that children who are the result of miscegenation are much more beautiful than either side of that equation. So what happens, when you're selling this argument and you travel a little further down the ideological road, you end up with losing the Jewish through line, kind of. Second question.
Okay, well, before so I don't forget, I don't think the danger of losing the Jewish through line is as extreme as you might be suggesting, or that many people suggest. The fact is that we have managed to mix and preserve And there are ways, so, I mean, Yechezkel Kaufman, who's best known for his work in biblical scholarship, wrote an absolutely amazing long history of Galut, right, of Jewish exile diaspora. And the central question to the entire work is, how is it that Jews survive, given the actual reality, which he admits, he's a good historian, that we mixed with everybody? So how did we preserve it? His answer, interestingly, is our religion and its practices, with the recognition that the practices actually did not erect boundaries as high or as thick as we are sometimes taught or imagine.
And I have my second question. I did a preamble. I'm preparing you for that. The other is, what happens to Hashana Haba Yerushalayim? What happens to
We preserve it.
Wait a minute.
Yeah,
What
go ahead.
happens to metaphorical Zionism as an aspirational ideal? What displaces it? You can't have multiple things displace one great idea. And secondly, as part of that, are we giving up on the notion of a light unto the nations? Are we giving up on Zion? Are we giving up on
a good
the
question.
perfectibility of an Israel, rather than this?
So first,
obscene-
Lashana Haba Yerushalayim. Lashana Haba Yerushalayim Lashana Haba Yerushalayim is not a Zionist expression. It is a messianic hope, right? And Jews who recited that through the ages never imagined that a secular force of Jews would gather, right, in order to retake that land and create a national home there. That is not what Lashana Haba Yerushalayim meant. That many came to understand it that way. As modern Zionists, of course, I understand that, but it's certainly not a necessary meaning, because this is very important. And I mean, you didn't ask a question that could you. Hoping for Zion and making a home and flourishing diaspora are not in opposition to one another. They are not dichotomously opposed. Quite the contrary, they are both crucial parts of the Jewish equation, where we make homes and flourish, God willing, in the places we live. If we don't flourish, we've moved on and made new homes that flourished elsewhere, all with the hope that one day we would return to Zion. And you say something about how do we preserve ourselves if we're mixing in. One part of the answer, frankly, is the hope that one day we would go back to Zion. One day, right? Now, the hope, was the crucial thing. Now, I'm not commenting on what this means for contemporary Zionists, right? All peoples use traditions however they want to do them. What I'm saying is that, yes, this is the way it's been used, and now I hope we can look at it from another perspective. Okay, our time is beginning to run short. Let's take another 5 minutes or so, but Anita, and then we'll come over here, yeah.
I have a couple of things, but I'll make them very short. Would it be at all helpful to make a distinction between exile and diaspora? Exile is something that I'm thrown out of. Diaspora is somewhere where I am. And I think it's worth at least thinking about that. This is not connected to the next comment.
No, before you go on, because
this one's better.
But before you go on, this is a very important distinction, exile diaspora, which many people take. What's his name? The historian, Jewish historian from NYU. Bob Chazin. Just a few years ago, he published a new book, very, very important book, which captured this notion in Migrant or Exile. Was that the name of the title? Right? Migrant or Exile. And it does a careful examination of the entirety of Jewish history and shows that many times we were cast out and many times we moved on because we saw greater possibilities elsewhere. I prefer not to use the distinction for the simple reason that there is no word in any traditional Hebrew for diaspora. And so when you go back to traditional sources, the word is always galut, but we have to take the word galut with a grain of salt and recognize that it's a kind of verbal tick. Right, that it has negative connotations, but it's actually often used not with negative intentions.
You invoked George Steiner.
Yes.
And my favorite George Steiner line is, "Our homeland, the text." right?
Yeah.
Which it seems you're working toward in a different, without saying exactly that, that is a non-geographic place of unity or idea of unity that is not based in geographic areas. The debate used to be, in my world, between Zionism and what in Yiddish was called here-ness, right? Do we build the great socialist reality where we live, where we actually are? Or do we build the great, in their case, socialist reality in Zion where we should be? But what's underneath all of that is not just, I think, not just a notion of homeland, which I actually think is important, but never mind, but rather a notion of what will bind us.
What will bind us?
Bind us.
Yes,
what
yes.
will
I mean, so we've
unify
already
us.
begun to discuss that. I would, the notion of text as homeland, Jews began with that notion very, very early on. Jews who had been exiled to Babylon created a text that would serve as the Jewish homeland for the rest of Jewish history. That text is the Torah. The Torah is the product of the diaspora community of Jews living in Babylon in the 6th century. And they recognized that if they wanted to survive, they needed a homeland that would move with them. And even when Jews returned, the irony is that that portable homeland was always available to us and ever expanding, whether it was in rabbinic literature and Hasidic literature and so forth, ever expanding because those literatures and their thoughts. And I would add to it, it's not just literature as text, it's not just literature as letter on paper, it's also the decoration on the page, the illumination on the page. All of those things enable us to create our metropolitan museums wherever we are.
Real quick. First of all, I need to ask basically my second question.
Okay, good.
And
Everyone has 2 questions. Okay.
Yeah, but I'll just say one thing. I would encourage you to think of a new term for us to use to replace the terms diaspora and exile. Because they're always starting from the basis of land, a physical location where we are not in some ways. And I think what you're proposing is a very different model.
Do you have a suggestion?
No, I was hoping you did.
Okay, if you come up with something, email me.
For sure. The second is a suggestion for how to think about what you have characterized as a couple thousand years of Jewish development in the diaspora. Another way to see this is we were thrust into different environments and we evolved over 2,000-3,000 years of history in relationship to that particular environment, that culture, that milieu. And we have words for that, right? We have words like evolution or what Dora will talk about. And you could see this as almost a survival of the fittest, to take the analogy to the extreme. We're still here.
We are.
Right? Moab and Elam and the Hittites and all those other people aren't, because we had the strength to evolve as needed, to adapt, adjust, and grow and flourish in different milieux over the years.
I mean, mostly I agree with what you just said. I just have 2 objections to the specifics. The first is it's not 2,000 years, it's 2,500 years.
Okay.
And no, but that's very
is Babylon.
important.
Right,
because once you introduce 2,000 years into the equation, you think on the land, off the land, on the land again, right? And that's not the way it was. The other, God, that was the one. I'm trying to remember what the other, that we were cast off into different environments and so forth. That's true, but we weren't always cast out. That's why Chazen's work is so important, because roughly for the first 1,000 years following the revolt against Rome, so following 70, for first 1,000 to 1,200 years, we were not cast out. During that entire period, we migrated. It was later that casting out became a feature of Jewish history, and that changes the equation.
Yeah, but my whole point is that we thrive.
Oh, absolutely, absolutely. I totally agree. Yep, Beth Me.
I'm looking forward to actually reading the book. It sounds wonderful. I'm curious about the generalized notion of what you're calling diaspora. I put it that way because for many years I worked with Mort Mandel, the philanthropist, and he refused to, when he wanted to talk about tfutzot, but he translated it as Jewish communities around the world, which is very parv but there's a value to it because it doesn't have this overlay of the ideology. I mean, it helps and it hinders. But so just since there are many different Jewish communities around the world, do you think, let's say in the case of the American Jewish community or French or what about the differences? I mean, a lot of us writing about American Jewry, there's been a sort of an exceptionalism story. And I'm wondering if some of the strengths of American Jewish life come out of things that happened here. Also, maybe
it's here that we were talking about diaspora. I tried to specify, in the book, I choose very specific cases and locate them to address precisely the diversity of experiences that you're describing, right? And in terms of, the exceptionalism with which we imagine the American Jewish community, right? You know more about this than I do in certain respects. I would only say that we're not as exceptional as we often imagine ourselves to be.
And I would say that in my own work, one thing I'm learning is that I like to use terms of estrangement and belonging, because there are dynamics that make it happen where Jews feel estranged from one another, from Israel, like we're feeling now, many of us. But belonging, and we feel estrangement from things going on here. So those dynamics coexist, just the way that you're breaking the dichotomy.
That's great, thank you. Okay, it's getting late. David, let's take the last question. What? One man ask a question? Okay, David's doing it. Okay.
On behalf of all men here.
Is that true? I didn't notice it. Okay.
First, I want to assure you, I've read the book. It's a great read. You're really going to enjoy it. Buy copies for your friends and family also. And David, I'm going to invite you to leave us with a word of hope. You've made a really strong case that Jewish intellectualism has survived and been enriched by the diaspora. Based on your comments, I have every confidence that Jewish intellectuals will survive and be enriched wherever they live. Tell us about liberal Jewish life outside of Israel.
Wait, are liberal Jews not intellectuals?
Tell us about the ones who are not intellectuals. Tell us a vision of how you see Jewish community.
Yeah, no, it's a good question.
Forward.
Okay, so first of all, I hope that some of the examples to which I've alluded makes it clear that I'm not talking only about intellectual elites. Right. Whether we're talking about popular song, artwork, wealth that's not part of the intellectual elite, popular culture. I mean, in the latter chapter, the pilgrimages. Right? That's not intellectual. That is religious, and that's part of your question, right? But it's not intellectual. And one of the things I address early in the book, as you know, is the ways I recognize, as someone who writes about rabbinic literature, that rabbinic literature is extremely elite. But there are ways that the rabbis were not the same kind of intellectual elite as some other intellectual elites. They were interested in being involved in communities and influencing those communities, and that affected the messages they conveyed. If they didn't convey messages in a way that the messages would be heard, we would have forgotten about the rabbis a long time ago. Okay? So now I'll focus on the part of your question of liberal Jews, and you said to be hopeful, so here, I'm gonna go back to a great album and album cover, Blind Faith. My blind faith is that if we have done it so well, so long, despite what we're confronting today, right, there is going to be a gathering in some common place 100, 200, 300 years from now, where more or less the exact same conversation will be going on, because, you know what? It's worth thinking about.
Because God will be with us wherever we are, God willing.
Exactly. God follows us wherever we are. You know that better than I do. Okay, thank you for
Thank
coming.
you, thank you.
Thank you on behalf of the JTS Library. This is our final book talk of this academic year. Come back in the future, for those of you online as well. And for those of you who are here, if you have not yet, books are available for sale. The normal sale price is $35, actually $34.99. And here you can get them for check or cash for $25.